The ballroom went completely silent when my brother's boss stepped up to the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet the CEO of Meridian Industries, Isabella Romano." Every face at that wedding reception turned to stare at me, the so-called family disappointment, sitting quietly in the back corner. My brother David's jaw dropped as he realized the woman he'd just humiliated in his wedding speech was actually his boss's boss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Isabella Romano, and for the past 3 years, my family has treated me like their charity case. While my older brother David climbed the corporate ladder at what he thought was a prestigious company, I was supposedly finding myself through various freelance projects and what they called my little business ventures. What they didn't know was that those ventures had grown into Meridian Industries, a tech conglomerate that had quietly acquired dozens of companies, including the one where David worked. The wedding was held at the luxurious Grandview Manor in Willowbrook, a venue that David and his new wife Elena had chosen specifically to showcase their success. Everything about that day was designed to project an image of achievement and stability. The crystal chandeliers, the imported Italian marble floors, the 10-course meal that cost more than most people's monthly salary. It was all carefully orchestrated to announce to our extended family that David Romano had made it. I arrived that morning wearing a simple navy dress that I'd bought off the rack, my hair pulled back in a modest bun, carrying nothing more than a small clutch. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, nothing that would draw attention to myself. I'd learned long ago that the most powerful position you can occupy is the one where people underestimate you completely. The ceremony itself was beautiful, though I couldn't help but notice how David kept glancing over at the section where all his colleagues from Brightstone Financial were seated. His boss, Mr. Harrison Webb, was there with his wife, along with several other executives from the company. David had been working there for 2 years as a senior analyst, and from the way he talked about it, you'd think he was running the place. What David didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 6 months ago, Meridian Industries had completed a full acquisition of Brightstone Financial. It wasn't hostile. It was actually quite friendly, orchestrated through a series of shell companies and intermediary firms. Harrison Webb, who David thought was the ultimate authority figure, now reported directly to me. The irony was almost too perfect. During the cocktail hour, I positioned myself near the bar, nursing a single glass of champagne and watching the social dynamics play out. David was in his element, working the room like a politician, making sure everyone knew about his recent promotion to senior analyst with portfolio management responsibilities. He introduced Elena to his colleagues as if he were presenting her to royalty, and I could see how much he enjoyed being the center of attention. "Isabella!" My cousin Marco spotted me and made his way over, his wife trailing behind him. "We weren't sure you'd make it. How's what is it you're doing these days?" This was the question I'd been getting all day. My aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, everyone wanted to know what the Romano family disappointment was up to. They asked with that particular mixture of curiosity and pity that you reserve for someone you're worried might ask you for money. "I'm keeping busy," I replied with a smile. "Lots of projects in the works." "Still doing that computer stuff?" asked Marco's wife, Sarah, in the tone people use when they're trying to be polite about something they don't understand. Something like that. What I didn't tell them was that my computer stuff had generated over $200 million in revenue last year alone. That my projects included the development of proprietary software that was revolutionizing how financial institutions managed risk assessment. That 3 of the top 10 Fortune 500 companies were currently in bidding wars to license my technology. As the evening progressed, I watched David bask in what he believed was his moment of triumph. During dinner, he regaled our table with stories about his insider knowledge of major corporate deals. completely unaware that I was the one who had ultimately approved most of them. He talked about his mentor, Harrison Webb, with such admiration that I almost felt guilty for not telling him the truth. The wedding speeches began around 9 o'clock. David's best man went first, followed by Elena's maid of honor, and then David himself took the microphone. What happened next was something I'll never forget. Not because it was shocking, but because it was so perfectly, predictably David. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced confidence. "Elena and I are surrounded by the people who matter most to us. Family, friends, and colleagues who have supported us on our journey to success." He paused for applause, then continued. "You know, success isn't something that just happens. It takes vision, dedication, and sometimes making tough choices about who you surround yourself with." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized where this was heading. "Take my sister Isabella, for example," David said, gesturing in my direction, as every head in the room turned to look at me. Let's say she's been finding her path for a while now, still figuring things out at 32. But hey, not everyone can be cut out for the corporate world, right?" The laughter that followed was polite, but uncomfortable. I could feel the mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment radiating from our relatives. "The point is," David continued, "success means different things to different people. For some of us, it means building a career, taking on responsibility, making an impact in the business world. For others, it means, taking your time to figure out what you want to be when you grow up." More uncomfortable laughter. Elena was trying to signal him to wrap it up, but David was on a roll. "So here's to all of us who chose the harder path, who stepped up and took on real challenges. And here's to those who are still working on it. We love you anyway." The applause was scattered and awkward. I sat there, maintaining my composure, even as I felt the familiar sting of being publicly diminished by someone who had no idea what they were talking about. That's when Harrison Webb stood up. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "I hate to interrupt, but I think there might be some confusion here." The room fell silent as one of David's professional heroes approached the microphone that David had just used to humiliate me. "David, you've told me so much about your family, but I don't think you've ever properly introduced me to your sister." Harrison's eyes found mine across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet the CEO of Meridian Industries, Isabella Romano." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. David's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, horror, and finally, a kind of pale understanding. "Isabella," Harrison continued, "founded Meridian 7 years ago and has built it into one of the most innovative companies in our sector. In fact, she's the reason I have a job at all. Meridian acquired our company 6 months ago." I stood up slowly, smoothing down my simple navy dress, and walked toward the front of the room. Every step felt like it took an eternity, but I kept my composure, even as I passed table after table of shocked relatives and David's mortified colleagues. When I reached the microphone, I looked out at the sea of faces, some confused, some amazed, some calculating how they'd completely misread the situation. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice steady. "And congratulations to David and Elena. This is your day, and I hope it's everything you dreamed it would be." The applause that followed was different from before, respectful, genuine, and tinged with the kind of awe that comes when people realize they've been in the presence of something extraordinary without knowing it. But this was just the beginning of the story. What happened next would change everything between my brother and me, and teach our entire family a lesson about the danger of assumptions. If you want to know how a family disappointment became the most successful person in the room without anyone noticing, stick around. Because what you just witnessed was years in the making, and the real story, the one about building an empire while everyone thinks you're failing, is just getting started. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story to understand how I ended up being called the family disappointment at my own brother's wedding. It was a crisp Saturday morning in October when I received the elegant, cream-colored invitation in the mail. David Michael Romano and Elena Catherine Voss request the pleasure of your company. The invitation was embossed with gold lettering, printed on the finest cardstock money could buy. Everything about it screamed expensive taste and careful planning. I was sitting in what my family believed was my tiny studio apartment in downtown Willowbrook, though they had no idea that I actually owned the entire building, a converted 1920s textile factory that I'd purchased and renovated into luxury lofts. My penthouse unit occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Clearwater River and a private rooftop garden that I'd designed myself. The Romano family dynamics had been established long before David's engagement to Elena. We were the children of Vincent and Maria Romano, second-generation Italian-Americans who had built a comfortable middle-class life through my father's small construction business and my mother's work as a high school guidance counselor. They were good, hard-working people who believed in traditional measures of success, stable jobs, steady paychecks, and clear career progressions that other people could understand and respect. David, 3 years older than me, had always been the golden child. He excelled in school, played varsity football, dated the homecoming queen, and graduated from Riverside University with a business degree and a job offer already in hand. He followed the prescribed path perfectly: entry-level position at a regional bank, steady promotions, professional networking events, and a LinkedIn profile that read like a textbook example of corporate achievement. E, on the other hand, had been the question mark in the family equation since high school. While David was student body president, I was the quiet kid in the back of advanced computer science classes, building websites for local businesses and teaching myself programming, languages that my teachers had never heard of. When David went to college for business, I chose computer engineering at Millfield Tech, a smaller school that specialized in emerging technologies. The real divergence began after graduation. David immediately launched into his corporate career, complete with business suits, networking mixers, and a downtown apartment that he loved showing off to our relatives. I, meanwhile, started what everyone called my experimental phase. I turned down 3 different job offers from established tech companies and instead began working from my childhood bedroom, taking on freelance programming projects and building something that I couldn't quite explain to anyone yet. That was 7 years ago. For the first 2 years, family gatherings were exercises in patient encouragement. Isabella's exploring her options, my mother would say with forced brightness. When relatives asked about my career, she's very talented with computers, my father would nod supportively while privately worrying that his daughter was wasting her expensive education on what he saw as hobby projects. By year 3, the encouragement had shifted to gentle concern. Maybe it's time to think about something more stable, became the common refrain. David, flush with his first major promotion, started offering to put in a good word for me at various companies where he had connections. The subtext was clear: your little experiment has gone on long enough. By year 5, concern had hardened into disappointment, mixed with pity. I was 30 years old, still living in what they thought was a modest apartment, driving a 7-year-old Honda Civic that I'd bought used, and showing up to family events in clothes that came from department stores rather than boutiques. Meanwhile, David had purchased a beautiful colonial house in Maplewood Heights, the suburb where successful young professionals went to start families. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. David's social media was filled with photos from corporate retreats, charity galas, and weekend trips to ski resorts. His Instagram stories showed expensive dinners, wine tastings, and the kind of lifestyle that our parents could point to with pride. Look what David accomplished, they could say to their friends. Senior analyst at Brightstone Financial, beautiful home, lovely girlfriend. When people asked about me, the conversation got more complicated. How do you explain a daughter who seems to be treading water professionally while her younger years slip away? How do you make sense of someone who appears to be choosing struggle over stability? What my family didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that I had been building something unprecedented during those 7 years of apparent aimlessness. While David was climbing someone else's corporate ladder, I was constructing my own skyscraper from the ground up. The wedding planning process had been particularly painful to watch from the outside. Elena, David's fiancée, was a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising agency. She was lovely, ambitious, and perfectly suited to the life that David was building. Together, they represented everything that looked right on paper. Two college-educated professionals with complementary careers, a solid financial foundation, and a clear trajectory toward the American dream of homeownership, children, and retirement planning. I genuinely liked Elena. She was kind to me in the way that people are kind to relatives they feel sorry for, and she never participated in the family's gentle interventions about my career choices. But I could see the confusion in her eyes when she looked at me. How could someone who was clearly intelligent seem so lost? How could David's sister be so different from the successful, driven man she was marrying? The engagement party had been held at the Riverside Country Club, the same venue where David had played junior golf and where our parents had celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. I arrived in a simple black dress and flats, carrying a modest gift, while everyone else seemed to be competing for who could look most successful. The conversations that night had been particularly brutal. Isabella! My Aunt Carmen had descended on me like a well-meaning hurricane. How are you, sweetie? Are you still doing that computer thing? Still programming. Yes, I'd replied, accepting. Her enthusiastic hug. Well, that's nice. Have you thought about maybe getting a real job in computers? You know, at a company? David was just telling us about all the tech people at his firm. Maybe he could introduce you to someone. The assumption underlying every conversation was the same. That I was failing at something I should have figured out by now, and that I needed their help to get back on track. The irony was almost unbearable, but I had learned to smile and nod and let them believe what they needed to believe. Because the truth was too complicated to explain and too unbelievable for them to accept, even if I tried. 3 months before David's wedding, I had received an offer from Titanium Ventures to acquire Meridian Industries for $1.2 billion. I had turned it down because I wasn't ready to stop building yet. But that offer, sitting in my private safe along with patents worth hundreds of millions and contracts with companies whose names would make David's colleagues weep with envy, represented everything my family thought I lacked: vision, success, and the kind of achievement that changes generations. So when David's wedding invitation arrived, embossed with gold and heavy with expectation, I knew exactly what I was walking into. A celebration of conventional success, surrounded by family members who loved me but couldn't understand me, watching my brother bask in accomplishments that looked enormous from the outside, but were actually quite small when you knew what real success looked like. I RSVP'd yes and marked my calendar, already anticipating the gentle questions about my future plans and the well-meaning suggestions about career opportunities. What I didn't anticipate was that David would choose his wedding reception as the moment to publicly declare me the family disappointment. That decision would change everything between us, in ways that he couldn't possibly have imagined when he picked up that microphone. David Romano had always been the kind of person who lit up a room simply by walking into it. At 35, He possessed that particular combination of confidence, charm, and conventional success that made him magnetic to both family members and professional colleagues. Standing 6'2" with the broad shoulders he'd maintained since his college football days, David carried himself with the easy assurance of someone who had never seriously doubted his place in the world. His corner office at Brightstone Financial was a shrine to achievement, carefully curated to tell the story of a man on his way up. The mahogany desk held a collection of crystal awards from various industry associations, each one positioned at precisely the right angle to catch the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Willowbrook's financial district. His diploma from Riverside University hung in a place of honor, flanked by photographs of him shaking hands with the mayor at charity events and posing with his team after closing major accounts. What made David particularly formidable was his genuine talent for relationship building. He wasn't just playing a role when he worked a room at networking events or company parties. He genuinely enjoyed connecting with people, remembering details about their lives, and finding ways to be helpful. His colleagues at Brightstone often said that David Romano could sell ice to an Eskimo, not because he was manipulative, but because he had a gift for understanding what people needed and positioning himself as the solution. His rise through the ranks at Brightstone had been steady and impressive. Starting as a junior analyst straight out of college, David had distinguished himself early by landing the Meridian Group account, a mid-sized consulting firm that had become one of Brightstone's most reliable clients. He'd negotiated the initial contract himself, impressing senior management with his thorough preparation and his ability to build rapport with the client's executives. That success had led to his first promotion within 18 months, making him the youngest senior analyst in the company's history at that time. But it was David's handling of the Clearwater Municipal Bond Initiative that had really put him on the map. The city of Clearwater had been struggling with infrastructure funding, and David had spent 6 months developing a comprehensive financial package that would allow them to modernize their water treatment facilities while maintaining fiscal responsibility. The deal was worth $12 million to Brightstone, and David's face had been featured on the cover of Regional Business Monthly with the headline, "Rising Star: How One Analyst Transformed Municipal Finance." Our parents had framed that magazine cover and hung it in their living room, right above the mantelpiece where everyone could see it. At family gatherings, it wasn't uncommon for Dad to casually steer conversation toward David's latest professional triumph, his voice swelling with pride as he described his son's contributions to the community and the business world. David's success wasn't limited to his professional life. He drove a charcoal gray BMW 5 Series that he'd purchased outright after his last bonus, and he lived in a stunning colonial house in Maplewood Heights that featured 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, and a gourmet kitchen that Elena loved to showcase on her Instagram stories. The house had been featured in the Willowbrook Home and Garden magazines, Young Professionals Making Their Mark issue, complete with photos of David and Elena hosting dinner parties for their friends and colleagues. His social calendar was a carefully orchestrated symphony of professional and personal networking. Tuesday evenings were reserved for the Young Professionals Association, where David served on the board of directors. Thursdays meant drinks with his Brightstone colleagues at Meridian's, the upscale gastropub that had become the unofficial gathering place for the financial district's rising stars. Weekends were often spent at charity golf tournaments, wine tastings, or dinner parties where David could effortlessly navigate conversations about market trends, local politics, and investment strategies. Elena Voss had been the perfect addition to this carefully constructed life. They'd met at a Chamber of Commerce mixer 2 years earlier, where she'd been representing her advertising agency, and he'd been there on behalf of Brightstone. Elena was beautiful in an understated way. Shoulder-length auburn hair, intelligent, green eyes, and the kind of professional polish that came from working in client-facing roles. She had her own career ambitions and her own circle of professional contacts, making her an ideal partner for someone like David, who valued both personal compatibility and strategic relationship building. Their courtship had been a masterclass, in modern professional romance. Weekend trips to wine country, attendance at gallery openings and theater premieres, collaborative participation in charity 5K runs and volunteer initiatives. Their engagement photos, taken at the historic Riverside Gardens, had been featured in the society pages of the Willowbrook Tribune. And Elena's engagement ring, a stunning 2-carat solitaire that David had selected after consulting with 3 different jewelers, had become the subject of admiring conversations among her friends and colleagues. What made David's success particularly impressive to our extended family was how effortless he made it all look. He never seemed stressed or overwhelmed, never complained about the pressure or the long hours. Instead, he approached each new challenge with the same confident enthusiasm that had carried him through college and into his professional life. When relatives asked him about work, his responses were always upbeat and filled with specific examples of projects he was excited about or clients he was helping to succeed. At family gatherings, David had become the unofficial master of ceremonies, the person everyone looked to for updates on the Romano family's achievements. He would regale aunts and uncles with stories about his latest business trips, his insights into market trends, and his plans for future growth at Brightstone. He had a gift for making complex financial concepts accessible to people who didn't work in his industry, and he genuinely enjoyed sharing his knowledge with family members who were curious about his work. His relationship with our parents had evolved into something approaching peer-level respect. Dad frequently sought David's advice on investment decisions and business matters, treating his son not just as a child who had done well, but as a genuine expert whose opinion carried weight. Mom bragged about David to her friends at the country club, sharing stories about his professional accomplishments and his thoughtful gestures toward Elena and the family. The engagement party at Riverside Country Club had been David's opportunity to showcase everything he'd built. The guest list had been a carefully curated mix of family members, college friends, and professional colleagues, creating an atmosphere where David could seamlessly demonstrate his success across all areas of his life. He'd given a toast that night that perfectly captured his approach to life, confident but humble, ambitious but grounded, successful but still committed to the values our parents had instilled in him. Elena and I are incredibly grateful to be surrounded by the people who have supported us and believed in us, he'd said, raising his champagne glass to the crowd of well-dressed guests. Success isn't something you achieve alone. It's something you build with the help of family, friends, and mentors who push you to be better than you ever thought possible. The applause that followed had been genuine and enthusiastic, and I had watched from my table near the back as David basked in the admiration of everyone who mattered to him. He had every reason to feel proud of what he'd accomplished. By any conventional measure, David Romano was exactly what a successful 35-year-old professional should be: financially secure, professionally respected, personally fulfilled, and positioned for continued growth and achievement. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that his little sister had been watching his rise with a mixture of genuine pride and private amusement. Because while David had been building an impressive career within the structure of someone else's company, I had been quietly constructing something that would make his achievements look like practice rounds for the real game. The irony wasn't lost on me that David's biggest professional triumph, the Meridian Group account that had launched his career, was actually a subsidiary of my own company. The consulting firm that had made him a rising star at Brightstone was one of the first acquisitions I'd made when Meridian Industries began its expansion into complementary service sectors. David had been negotiating with my own employees without ever knowing it, impressing them with his professionalism and strategic thinking while I watched the reports of his progress with quiet pride in my little brother's capabilities. But as David's wedding day approached, and as the family's treatment of me as the disappointment became more pronounced, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when the truth finally came to light. How would the golden child react when he discovered that his struggling sister had actually built the empire he was still dreaming of joining? The morning of David's wedding, I woke up in my penthouse to 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from various family members who had suddenly remembered that the family disappointment might need extra help getting ready for such an important social event. The messages ranged from my cousin Lisa offering to do my makeup. "I know you don't usually wear much, but this is David's special day," to my Aunt Carmen, suggesting I borrow one of her dresses because "we want you to look your best, sweetie." The underlying assumption in every message was the same, that I couldn't be trusted to present myself appropriately without intervention. As if my apparent career struggles had somehow rendered me incapable of dressing myself for a formal event. I smiled as I read through them while sipping my morning espresso, prepared with beans that cost more per pound than most people spent on groceries in a week. By the time I arrived at the bridal suite to help Elena with her final preparations, the Romano family intervention machine was already in full swing. My mother had arrived with the emergency makeup kit, just in case Isabella needs touching up, and my Aunt Patricia had brought along 3 different pairs of earrings for me to choose from, explaining that she'd noticed I never really accessorize properly for formal occasions. "Oh, honey," my mother said the moment she saw me, her voice carrying that particular tone of loving disappointment that I'd become so familiar with over the years. "Is that really what you're wearing?" I was wearing a navy blue silk dress that had actually been custom-made by a designer in Milan, paired with shoes that cost more than most people's monthly car payments. But because the designer wasn't a household name, and because I'd chosen elegant simplicity over flashy labels, it looked to my family like something I might have picked up at a department store. "It's a beautiful dress, Mom," Elena said diplomatically, though I could see her making mental calculations about whether my appearance would detract from her wedding photos. "Well, yes, it's fine," my mother conceded. "But Isabella, this is such an important day for David. Don't you want to make more of an effort? You know how many of his colleagues will be there." The implication hung in the air like expensive perfume, that I should be using David's wedding as an opportunity to network, to perhaps finally meet someone who could help me find a real job. The idea that I might already have professional connections that dwarfed David's entire LinkedIn network was so far outside their realm of possibility that it never even occurred to them. My cousin Maria, who worked as a receptionist at a medical office and considered herself the family expert on professional presentation, decided to take charge of the situation. "Isabella, come here. Let me see what we can do with your hair." For the next 20 minutes, I endured a series of well-meaning but increasingly patronizing suggestions about how I could improve my appearance. Maria insisted on adding more volume to my hair. My Aunt Patricia clipped on a pair of rhinestone earrings that clashed with everything else I was wearing. And my mother applied what she called a little more color to my lips, transforming my subtle lipstick into something that belonged in a 1980s music video. "There," Maria announced triumphantly. "Now you look like you belong at a society wedding." I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. In their eagerness to help me rise to the occasion, my family had transformed me from understated elegance into something that looked like their idea of what success should look like. It was a perfect metaphor for how they approached my entire life, taking something that was already exactly what it needed to be, and trying to force it into their limited understanding of what looked right. The ceremony itself was beautiful, but I spent most of it fielding whispered comments from relatives who had positioned themselves around me like a protective detail. My Uncle Frank, who owned a small plumbing business, kept leaning over to point out David's colleagues and explain who they were, as if I should be taking notes for future networking opportunities. "See that tall guy in the gray suit?" he whispered during the processional. "That's David's boss, Harrison Webb. Very important man. You should introduce yourself at the reception. Maybe he knows someone who could help you get your foot in the door somewhere." My Aunt Rose, sitting on my other side, nodded enthusiastically. "And that woman in the blue dress next to him? That's his wife, Margaret. She volunteers at the hospital, foundation. Such accomplished people. You could learn a lot from them." The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. Harrison Webb, The man my uncle was treating like royalty had been sending me detailed reports every quarter for the past 6 months. Margaret Webb, the accomplished volunteer, had unknowingly been working with a charity that received significant funding from one of Meridian Industries' philanthropic initiatives. These people weren't networking opportunities for me. They were part of my extended professional family, reporting up through a chain of command that ultimately led to my office. During the cocktail hour, the patronizing reached new heights. I found myself surrounded by a rotating cast of family members who had apparently coordinated their efforts to help me make the most of the social opportunity that David's wedding represented. Isabella. My cousin Tony approached with his wife, both of them beaming with the kind of aggressive friendliness that people use when they're about to give you life advice. "We've been meaning to talk to you. Lisa's company is hiring, and we think you'd be perfect for one of their openings." Lisa worked for a small marketing firm that specialized in local restaurant promotions. The position they were describing was an entry-level social media coordinator role that paid about what I spent on coffee in a typical month. "It's really entry-level," Lisa admitted, "but it could be a great way for you to get some real business experience. You know, learn how a proper company operates, understand professional expectations, that sort of thing. And the best part," Tony added with enthusiasm, "is that it comes with health insurance and a 401k. You really need to start thinking about your future, Isabella. You can't freelance forever." The concern in their voices was genuine, which somehow made it worse. They truly believed they were helping me, offering me a lifeline to escape the professional quicksand they thought I was trapped in. The fact that my quarterly 401k contributions were larger than most people's annual salaries was information that belonged to a parallel universe as far as they were concerned. My Aunt Carmen materialized with a fresh angle of attack. "Isabella, sweetheart, I've been talking to some of the other mothers here, and several of them mentioned that their companies are always looking for people with computer skills. Nothing fancy, just basic office work, data entry, filing, maybe some light bookkeeping, perfect for someone who's still figuring out their career path." She said computer skills the way someone might say finger painting, as if my technical expertise was a cute hobby that might translate into simple clerical work if I was lucky. The woman who had revolutionized risk assessment algorithms for the financial services industry was being encouraged to apply for data entry positions. My mother joined the conversation with a fresh wave of maternal concern. "You know, Isabella, your father and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider going back to school. Maybe get an MBA or take some business courses. David always says that networking is so important in the corporate world." "I could ask David to introduce you to some people," she continued. "He knows so many successful professionals. Maybe someone would be willing to mentor you, help you understand how to present yourself in a business environment." The suggestion that I needed David to teach me about business networking was particularly rich, considering that I had been invited to speak at 3 different industry conferences in the past year alone. I had turned down all of them, preferring to maintain my low profile, but the irony of my mother suggesting that my brother could help me understand professional environments was almost too much to bear. As the evening progressed, the parade of helpful suggestions continued. My cousin Mike, who worked in middle management at a regional insurance company, offered to put in a good word for me with his human resources department. My Aunt Patricia suggested I consider going back to school for nursing, since there's always demand for healthcare workers, and it's steady, reliable work. Each suggestion was delivered with the kind of gentle insistence that comes from people who are certain they know what's best for you. They weren't trying to be cruel. They genuinely believed they were offering me opportunities to improve my life and finally achieve the kind of stability and success that David had already attained. What they couldn't understand was that I had deliberately chosen invisibility over recognition, substance over appearance, and long-term empire building over short-term validation. While they worried about my lack of health insurance, I was funding medical research initiatives. While they concerned themselves with my retirement planning, I was building generational wealth that would impact my family for decades to come. But the most painful part wasn't their misunderstanding of my situation. It was their absolute certainty that they knew better than I did about what my life should look like. Every suggestion, every offer of help, every concerned conversation was built on the fundamental assumption that I was failing at something they had figured out, and that their conventional wisdom was exactly what I needed to get back on track. I stood there in my rhinestone earrings and over-applied lipstick, nodding politely at suggestions that I apply for jobs that paid less than I donated to charity each month. I couldn't help but think about how this same dynamic had been playing out for 7 years. The only difference was that tonight, David's professional world and our family world were about to collide in a way that would finally reveal just how wrong everyone had been about everything. While my family spent the cocktail hour discussing my career prospects in hushed, concerned tones, I excused myself to the ladies' room and finally checked my phone for the first time since arriving at Grandview Manor. What I found there would have stopped every conversation in that ballroom cold if anyone had been able to see it. 17. Missed calls from my executive assistant, Rebecca Chen, who was managing the final details of 3 major acquisitions that were scheduled to close on Monday morning. 43 text messages from various department heads at Meridian Industries, all marked urgent, and all relating to deals worth more money than everyone at this wedding would earn in their combined lifetimes. And one email that made me smile. Despite everything, a message from the tech editor at Fortune magazine, requesting a follow-up interview for their Visionary CEOs Under 40 cover story that would be running next month. I scrolled through Rebecca's messages first. Isabella, the Singapore team needs your approval on the Chen Pacific merger terms. They're offering an additional $50 million but want to restructure the timeline. The Chen Pacific deal alone was worth $2.8 billion, representing Meridian Industries' expansion into Southeast Asian markets that would make us one of the largest privately held tech conglomerates in the world. Another message from Rebecca. The legal team finished reviewing the Brightstone acquisition documents. Everything's ready for your signature. Funny coincidence that your brother works there. Small world. Small world indeed. What Rebecca didn't know was that the acquisition of Brightstone Financial had been motivated by more than just business strategy. 6 months ago, when I'd first learned that David worked there, I'd ordered a comprehensive analysis of the company's operations, financial health, and growth potential. What I'd discovered was a mid-sized regional firm with solid fundamentals but limited vision. Exactly the kind of company that could benefit from Meridian's resources and global reach, while providing us with deeper penetration into secondary markets. The acquisition had been structured through a series of shell companies and proxy firms, standard practice for hostile takeovers that needed to remain confidential until the final moment. David, like everyone else at Brightstone, had no idea that the gradual changes in company policy over the past few months, the improved healthcare benefits, the increased technology budget, the mysterious new efficiency consultants, were all part of Meridian's integration planning. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Marcus Torres, Meridian's chief financial officer. Board meeting moved to Tuesday to accommodate the Brightstone announcement. Press release is drafted and ready. Should we coordinate with HR about retention offers for key personnel? Key personnel. Marcus was referring to the Brightstone employees, whose skills and client relationships made them valuable enough to retain during the transition. David, with his strong performance record and client portfolio, was definitely on that list. In fact, his employee file, which I'd reviewed personally, showed consistently high ratings and client satisfaction scores that had impressed even our most demanding department heads. Another message caught my attention, this one from our head of corporate development. The Japanese partnership agreements are finalized. Yamamoto Industries is officially on board for the joint venture. Total project value now at $4.2 billion. Congratulations, Isabella. This makes us the largest Western tech company operating in Japan. I leaned against the marble sink in the ladies' room, processing the surreal contrast between my two realities. Outside this door, my family was discussing whether I might be qualified for entry-level office work. Inside this bathroom, I was managing business deals that would be front-page news in the Wall Street Journal when they were announced next week. The Keek Yamamoto partnership had been 2 years in the making, requiring dozens of trips to Tokyo, countless cultural consultations, and negotiations so complex that they'd required their own dedicated legal team. The joint venture would give Meridian Industries exclusive access to Japanese manufacturing capabilities while providing Yamamoto with our proprietary software technologies. It was exactly the kind of visionary deal-making that had built my company into a global powerhouse. My phone rang, and I saw Rebecca's number. I answered quietly, knowing she wouldn't call unless it was genuinely urgent. Isabella, I'm so sorry to bother you during your brother's wedding, but the German team is having second thoughts about the timeline for the Frankfurt office opening. They want to push it back 6 months. Absolutely not, I said, keeping my voice low. The Frankfurt office opens in January as planned. If they need additional resources, approve whatever they need, but the timeline doesn't change. Our clients are expecting full European operations by Q1. Understood. And one more thing. The Wall Street Journal wants to schedule that profile interview for next month. They specifically mentioned wanting to discuss your approach to invisible leadership and how you've built such a large company while maintaining complete anonymity. Invisible leadership. That phrase had become associated with my management. Style after a Harvard Business Review article had analyzed Meridian Industries' growth pattern and noted that despite our massive success, our CEO remained virtually unknown to the public. The article had praised the strategic advantages of building an empire without building a personal brand, allowing the work to speak for itself rather than relying on celebrity and media attention. What the Harvard Business Review didn't know was that my invisibility strategy had been born out of necessity rather than choice. When I'd started Meridian Industries 7 years ago, I'd been so young and the tech industry so dominated by male personalities that I'd decided to let my results do the talking while I built something too big to ignore. By the time I was established, enough to step into the spotlight, I'd discovered that I preferred the freedom that came with anonymity. Another text message arrived, this one from our European Operations Director. Isabella, the London Stock Exchange is definitely interested in the IPO discussion. They're projecting a valuation between 8 and 12 billion if we go public next year. Should I schedule the preliminary meetings? $12 billion. I tried to imagine explaining to my Aunt Carmen that her suggestion about data entry positions was being made to someone whose company was potentially worth $12 billion. The number was so large that it felt abstract even to me, despite having built the company that generated it. But perhaps the most ironic message of all came from my Director of Philanthropy. The Romano Family Foundation paperwork is complete. Your parents' mortgage has been paid off as requested, along with college funds for all your cousin's children. Everything was processed through the Shell Foundation, so there's no way to trace it back to you or Meridian. As far as they know, it was an anonymous benefactor who was impressed by your father's community service work. The Romano Family Foundation was one of my private projects, a way to take care of my extended family without them ever knowing where the help was coming from. Over the past 3 years, mysterious grants and community service awards had quietly paid for my cousin Maria's medical school tuition, my Uncle Frank's business expansion loan, and dozens of other financial challenges that my family had faced without ever realizing that their struggling Isabella was the one solving their problems. I scrolled through more messages from various department heads, each one representing a piece of the vast business empire I'd built while my family worried about my lack of health insurance. Messages about patent applications that would revolutionize data storage, about renewable energy investments that would transform entire industries, about research partnerships with universities that would advance human knowledge in ways that hadn't been possible before Meridian's innovations. One final message made me pause, this one from Harrison Webb himself. Isabella, looking forward to seeing you at David's wedding tonight. Should be interesting when everyone realizes who you are. Let me know if you want me to handle the revelation gently, or if you prefer the full dramatic impact. Harrison had become one of my most trusted executives since the Brightstone acquisition process began. He was exactly the kind of thoughtful, strategic leader that Meridian looked for in our subsidiary companies, and he'd handled the integration process with the kind of professionalism that made complicated transitions seem effortless. More importantly, he understood the delicate family dynamics at play and had offered to help manage the revelation in whatever way would be least disruptive to David's special day. I typed back quickly, "Let's see how the evening unfolds. If David gives me an opening, I think the truth will speak for itself." As I prepared to rejoin the reception, I caught my reflection in the ladies' room mirror. The rhinestone earrings my aunt had insisted I wear caught the light, and my mother's heavy-handed lipstick application made me look like someone playing dress-up rather than someone who belonged in corporate boardrooms. It was a perfect metaphor for how my family saw me. Someone who needed their help to look the part. Someone who required their guidance to understand how success was supposed to work. In a few hours, when Harrison Webb stepped up to that microphone, all of these messages, all of these billion-dollar deals, all of this hidden reality would finally come to light. My family would discover that their charity case had actually been taking care of them all along, that their disappointment had actually been their greatest success story, and that their well-meaning advice had been offered to someone who had already achieved everything they thought she was incapable of reaching. I put my phone away, smoothed down my navy dress, and prepared to return to a reception where people would continue treating me like I needed their help, completely unaware that I was the most powerful person in the room. When I returned from the ladies' room, the reception was in full swing, and it seemed like my brief absence had only intensified my family's determination to help me make the most of this networking opportunity. What I discovered was that they had apparently held a strategy session while I was gone, because suddenly everyone had very specific suggestions about how I should approach the evening. My cousin Jessica materialized at my elbow with a champagne flute and a mission. "Isabella, perfect timing. I've been talking to some of David's colleagues and they are so impressive. You really need to circulate more. This isn't the time to be shy." Before I could respond, she had linked her arm through mine and was steering me toward a cluster of Brightstone financial executives who were discussing quarterly performance metrics near the ice sculpture. "Now, when you meet these people, remember to ask them about their work, show genuine interest, and maybe don't mention the freelancing thing right away. Let them get to know you first." The irony was suffocating. Jessica was coaching me on how to network with my own employees, people who ultimately reported to me through a chain of command that led directly to my office. I was about to be introduced to people who had been implementing my strategic directives for the past 6 months without knowing it. "Gentlemen," Jessica announced with the enthusiasm of someone presenting a charity case to potential donors, "I'd like you to meet my cousin Isabella. She's David's sister, and she's very interested in learning about the financial services industry. Very interested in learning about the financial services industry." I managed to maintain my composure as 3 Brightstone executives turned to greet me with the kind of polite attention that successful professionals give to relatives of colleagues when they're trying to be nice at social events. "Isabella, we've heard so much about you from David," said Robert Chen, one of Brightstone's senior analysts. What Robert didn't know was that I had personally reviewed his performance evaluations and had been impressed enough with his risk assessment capabilities to flag him for a significant promotion once the acquisition was complete. "David's told us you work with computers," added Sarah Martinez, the head of client relations, her tone suggesting that working with computers was roughly equivalent to having an interesting hobby. Sarah had no idea that the new client management software that had revolutionized her department's efficiency ratings had been developed by one of Meridian's subsidiary companies under my direct supervision. Jessica beamed with pride, as if she'd Successfully arranged a meeting between a struggling job seeker and potential employers. Isabella's been doing some really interesting projects. Haven't you, Isabella? The pause before projects was loaded with meaning. In Jessica's mind, she was being diplomatic about my lack of steady employment, while still trying to present me in the best possible light. She genuinely thought she was helping me by downplaying what she saw as my professional shortcomings, while emphasizing what she hoped might be transferable skills. "That's wonderful," Robert said with practiced corporate politeness. "What kind of computer work do you do?" Before I could answer, my Aunt Patricia appeared with reinforcements. She had recruited my Uncle Tony and his wife Linda, and they approached our little group like a well-coordinated intervention team. "Isabella," Patricia announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear, "we've been telling everyone about your situation, and you won't believe how many people here have connections that could help you." My situation. The phrase hung in the air like a diagnosis, immediately signaling to Robert, Sarah, and their colleagues that they were now part of a charitable networking effort rather than a casual social conversation. Linda jumped in with breathless enthusiasm. "My neighbor's daughter works in HR at a tech company, and she says they're always looking for people with basic computer skills. It's not glamorous work, but it's a foot in the door, you know?" Tony nodded sagely. "The important thing is to get into a structured environment where you can learn proper business practices. Show them you're trainable, that you understand corporate culture." I watched Robert and Sarah exchange glances, clearly trying to navigate the awkward social dynamics of a family that was essentially conducting a public job counseling session at a wedding reception. They had no way of knowing that the person they were being asked to help was actually the one who would determine their career trajectories going forward. "Actually," Sarah said diplomatically, "Brightstone is always interested in people with technical backgrounds. What kind of software experience do you have?" Before I could respond, my mother appeared as if summoned by some invisible family networking signal. "Oh, Isabella knows all about computers," she said with the kind of proud but concerned tone that parents use when discussing a child's unusual talents. "She's always been so good with technology, but she's never really found the right opportunity to use it professionally. Never found the right opportunity." I was standing 15 feet away from Harrison Webb, who could have told everyone at that table that I had personally negotiated technology licensing deals worth more than Brightstone's entire annual revenue. Instead, my mother was presenting me as someone with untapped potential, who just needed the right guidance to translate my hobby into a real career. Uncle Frank decided this was the perfect moment to share his perspective on my professional development. "The problem with Isabella," he announced to the growing circle of Brightstone executives, "is that she's been working alone for too long. She doesn't understand how real businesses operate. You know? All this freelance stuff doesn't teach you about teamwork, about corporate responsibility." Corporate responsibility. I had literally written the corporate responsibility guidelines that Brightstone Financial had adopted after the acquisition. The environmental initiatives, the employee wellness programs, the community investment strategies, all of them had been developed based on Meridian Industries' best practices and implemented under my ultimate authority. The conversation was attracting more attention now, as other family members began to orbit our group, drawn by the opportunity to help solve Isabella's career problems in front of an audience of accomplished professionals. My cousin Mike approached with his wife Jennifer, both of them carrying business cards like they were emergency medical supplies. "Isabella, you have to meet Jennifer's boss," Mike announced. "He owns 3 insurance offices, and Jennifer thinks you'd be perfect for their customer service department. It comes with full benefits, and they'll train you on all their systems. Customer service." I bit my tongue to keep from mentioning that Meridian Industries had customer service contracts with some of the largest corporations in the world, generating annual revenues that exceeded the GDP of small countries. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "It's really entry-level, but honestly, that might be exactly what you need. A chance to learn how professional offices work, how to interact with clients, that sort of thing." The Brightstone executives were now trapped in an increasingly surreal conversation where a family was essentially auctioning off their disappointing relative to anyone who might be willing to give her a chance. Robert and Sarah were being professionally polite, but I could see the discomfort in their expressions as they realized they were expected to participate in what amounted to a public intervention. "You know what Isabella's real problem is?" announced my Aunt Carmen, who had apparently appointed herself as the family's career counselor. "She's been hiding behind computers for too long. She needs to get out there, learn to present herself professionally, develop some real business skills." Hiding behind computers. The woman who had revolutionized data analytics for the financial services industry was being accused of hiding behind the very technology that had made her one of the most powerful people in the room. "Carmen's absolutely right," agreed my mother. "Isabella has so much potential, but she's never really learned how to package herself properly. Look at David. He understands how to build relationships, how to present his achievements, how to make people take him seriously." The suggestion that I needed to learn from David how to make people take me seriously was particularly rich, considering that David's most significant professional achievement to date had been managing accounts that ultimately belonged to companies I owned. At this point, Harrison Webb had moved closer to our group, though he was maintaining a careful distance while observing the family dynamics with barely concealed amazement. I caught his eye briefly, and he raised an eyebrow in a look that clearly said, "Should I put them out of their misery now, or do you want to let this continue?" I gave him the slightest shake of my head. This was too fascinating to interrupt. I was watching my family conduct a masterclass in assumptions, demonstrating with perfect clarity how people could be so convinced of their own understanding that they became completely blind to reality. "The thing is," my Uncle Tony was explaining to the increasingly uncomfortable Brightstone executives, "Isabella's smart, but she doesn't know how to apply that intelligence in a business context. She needs mentorship, structure, someone to show her how successful people operate. Someone to show me how successful people operate." I was standing in a room where I was, by any objective measure, the most successful person present, listening to my family explain to my own employees that I needed guidance on how to achieve professional success. The conversation had now attracted the attention of other wedding guests, creating a small crowd of people who were witnessing what they believed was a family's loving but public attempt to help their struggling relative find direction. What they were actually witnessing was a perfect demonstration of how completely wrong well-meaning people could be about someone they thought they knew. While my family continued their public career counseling session, I found myself thinking about the layers of preparation that had brought us to this moment. What they saw as spontaneous networking opportunities were actually the result of 7 years of carefully orchestrated strategic planning that would culminate in tonight's revelation. The truth was, every person in this ballroom who mattered professionally was here because I had specifically arranged for them to be here. 6 months ago, when David had first mentioned his engagement and the guest list he and Elena were planning, I had quietly ensured that key Brightstone executives would not only attend, but would have compelling reasons to stay for the entire reception. Harrison Webb's presence, for instance, wasn't just courtesy, it was strategic. 3 weeks ago, I had personally called him to discuss the importance of maintaining strong relationships with Brightstone employees during the transition period. "The Romano wedding," I had told him, "will be an excellent opportunity to observe team dynamics in a relaxed setting and identify the cultural elements we want to preserve as we integrate the companies." What Harrison didn't know until this week was that the Romano family he'd be observing included David's mysterious sister, the one David occasionally mentioned as his brilliant but directionless sibling who was still finding herself professionally. When Harrison had made the connection and realized that his CEO would be attending her brother's wedding as a guest, he had immediately understood the delicate dynamics at play. The Brightstone executives currently listening to my family's career advice had been carefully selected for retention during the acquisition. Robert Chen, who was nodding politely as my Uncle Frank explained the importance of real-world business experience, had been identified by our human resources team as someone with exceptional analytical capabilities and leadership potential. His promotion to Director of Risk Assessment, a position that would triple his current salary, was already approved and would be announced next month. Sarah Martinez, who was trying to look interested as my cousin Mike described the benefits of customer service work, had no idea that she was being groomed to head Meridian's new Client Relations Excellence Initiative, a program that would make her one of the most influential professionals in the financial services industry. The new client management protocols she had been testing at Brightstone were actually pilot programs for systems that would eventually be implemented across all of Meridian's subsidiary companies. Even the venue selection had been influenced by factors my family couldn't see. Grandview Manor wasn't just chosen for its elegance, it was owned by Clearwater Holdings, a property management company that had been acquired by Meridian Industries 18 months ago. The executive chef who had prepared tonight's dinner was the same one who catered Meridian's board meetings. The event coordinator who had worked with Elena to plan every detail of this reception reported to a management company that ultimately answered to me. In my evening clutch, next to my phone with its urgent business messages, was a leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape everyone's understanding of tonight's dynamics. The acquisition paperwork for Brightstone Financial, finalized and ready for Monday's announcement. Promotion letters for key personnel, including several people currently listening to my family's networking advice. And a personal letter I had, written to David, explaining not just what had happened, but why I had structured the acquisition to protect his position and advance his career, rather than simply replacing him with external candidates. The financial arrangements alone would have been incomprehensible to my well-meaning relatives. The acquisition of Brightstone Financial represented just 2.3% of Meridian Industries' total assets, a relatively minor addition to a portfolio that included technology companies, manufacturing facilities, research laboratories, and real estate, holdings across 4 continents. The amount we were paying for Brightstone, $340 million, was less than I had personally earned in dividends last quarter. But the human arrangements were far more complex and had required months of careful planning. Every Brightstone employee who would be retained had been evaluated not just for their professional capabilities, but for their potential fit within Meridian's corporate culture. The severance packages for those who wouldn't be continuing had been structured to provide generous transition support rather than the bare minimum required by law. The integration timeline had been designed to minimize disruption to ongoing client relationships while maximizing opportunities for professional growth among remaining staff. David's position had required particularly delicate handling. His employee file showed consistent high-performance ratings, strong client relationships, and exactly the kind of strategic thinking that Meridian valued in its subsidiary leadership teams. More importantly, his colleagues respected him, and his clients trusted him, qualities that couldn't be replaced simply by hiring external talent. The promotion I had approved for David would make him Regional Director of Client Development, overseeing the expansion of Brightstone's services into new markets while maintaining responsibility for the high-value accounts he had cultivated. It was a position that would more than double his current salary and put him on a trajectory toward executive leadership within the Meridian family of companies. What made the situation particularly complex was that David would be working for his sister without initially knowing it. Meridian's corporate structure was designed to preserve the autonomy of subsidiary companies while providing strategic oversight and resource support. David would report to Harrison Webb, who would report to Meridian's Financial Services Division, which would report to me. But the day-to-day operations at Brightstone would continue much as they had before, with additional resources and expanded opportunities. The Romano Family Foundation documents in my portfolio represented another layer of preparation that my family couldn't see. Over the past 3 years, I had been systematically addressing every financial challenge that had touched our extended family, always through anonymous channels that prevented anyone from connecting the assistance back to me. My cousin Maria's medical school loans, paid off through a merit scholarship from an educational foundation that existed solely to support the Romano family's next generation. Uncle Frank's plumbing business expansion, funded through a small business development grant that had appeared just when his bank loan application was struggling. My parents' mortgage, eliminated through a community service recognition award that honored my father's volunteer work with local veterans. Even tonight's wedding had benefited from invisible support. When Elena and David had been struggling with the costs of their dream venue, a mysterious, last-minute cancellation had made Grandview Manor available at a significantly reduced rate. The photographer they couldn't originally afford had suddenly offered them a special package deal. The flowers that had seemed beyond their budget had been donated by a vendor who claimed to be building portfolio pieces for marketing purposes. Every gift, every financial assistance, every opportunity that had improved my family's circumstances over the past several years had ultimately come from the daughter they pitied for her lack of financial stability. I had been their anonymous benefactor while they worried about my ability to take care of myself. The wedding favors sitting at each table setting had been produced by one of Meridian's specialty manufacturing partners. The wine being served had been selected from a vineyard that Meridian had invested in 2 years ago. Even the musicians performing during dinner were artists whose careers had been supported through Meridian's Arts Foundation initiatives. But perhaps the most carefully orchestrated element of tonight's preparation was the timing of the revelation itself. David's wedding speech, which I knew would include some reference to family success stories and different paths in life, would provide the perfect opening for Harrison to step forward with information that would recontextualize everything my family thought they understood about their dynamics. The speech David was planning, I had heard him practicing parts of it during the rehearsal dinner, would include comments about different definitions of success and the importance of supporting family members who were still finding their way. It was the kind of well-meaning but patronizing observation that David genuinely believed was supportive, and it would create the perfect contrast for what would follow. In my evening clutch, alongside the acquisition documents and foundation paperwork, was my own speech, the one I would give if called upon to respond to whatever David said about my life and career. It was brief, gracious, and designed to shift the evening's focus back to celebrating David and Elena's marriage rather than dwelling on the family dynamics that were about to be permanently altered. As I watched my relatives continue their networking intervention with my own employees, I couldn't help but appreciate the symmetry of the moment. For 7 years, I had been building an empire while they built assumptions. Tonight, both would finally be revealed. The dinner service had concluded, and the ballroom was buzzing with that particular energy that comes just before the formal speeches begin. I watched from my assigned table, strategically placed in the back corner by Elena's well-meaning seating chart that grouped David's family together, as the wedding coordinator began setting up the microphone and testing the sound system. David was in his element, making final rounds to each table, ensuring that every guest felt personally acknowledged before he took center stage. He moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of working a crowd, stopping to shake hands with his Brightstone colleagues, embracing elderly relatives, and posing for candid photos with Elena's college friends. What struck me was how genuinely happy he looked. This wasn't just professional networking disguised as celebration. David was truly enjoying his moment of triumph, surrounded by everyone who mattered to him, ready to share his joy and gratitude with a room full of people who admired and respected him. Despite everything that was about to unfold, I felt a surge of protective affection for my brother. He deserved this happiness, and what was coming next would enhance rather than diminish it. Elena had changed into her reception dress, a stunning ivory silk creation that complemented her auburn hair perfectly. She was glowing with that particular radiance that comes from being completely confident that everything was going exactly as planned. Her parents, seated at the head table, were beaming with pride as they watched their daughter navigate her role as the evening's co-host with natural grace and warmth. The photographers were positioning themselves strategically around the room, ready to capture the speeches that would become family treasures for decades to come. The videographer had set up his equipment to record everything, ensuring that David and Elena would be able to relive this moment whenever they wanted to remember how perfect their wedding day had been. My family members had finally concluded their impromptu career counseling session and were returning to their tables, looking satisfied with their networking efforts on my behalf. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me an encouraging smile, clearly proud of how they had helped me make connections with David's professional colleagues. My father was deep in conversation with my Uncle Tony, probably sharing observations about the quality of people at David's workplace and what that suggested about his future prospects. Harrison Webb had positioned himself at a table with other Brightstone executives, but I noticed that he had chosen a seat with a clear view of both the microphone and my table. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me the slightest nod, a signal that he was ready to play his part when the moment came. The other Brightstone employees at his table were relaxed and enjoying themselves, completely unaware that their company had already changed hands and that their futures had been carefully planned by the woman their colleague's family had spent the evening trying to help find employment. The wedding coordinator tapped the microphone, sending a brief squeal of feedback through the sound system that immediately captured everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're ready to begin our toasts for the evening." A wave of anticipation rippled through the ballroom as conversations quieted and guests turned their chairs toward the head table where David and Elena were seated. The formal program would begin with Elena's maid of honor, followed by David's best man, and then David himself would close with what the printed program described as remarks from the groom. I had heard enough of David's practice sessions to know that his speech would be heartfelt and well-crafted, touching on themes of gratitude, partnership, and the importance of family support. I also knew, from conversations I'd overheard during the rehearsal dinner, that he planned to acknowledge various family members individually, including a section about different paths to success that would specifically reference my own journey. That reference would be the opening Harrison needed. From my strategic position in the back corner, I could see virtually everyone in the room. My extended family was scattered across several tables, all of them looking forward to hearing David speak about the Romano family values that had shaped his success. They had no idea that they were about to witness a fundamental shift in their understanding of those values and how they had actually played out in their children's lives. The Brightstone financial contingent occupied 2 full tables near the front of the room, representing both David's immediate colleagues and some of the senior leadership team that would be transitioning into the Meridian family of companies. I recognized several faces from the employee files I had reviewed during the acquisition planning process. Talented professionals who had no idea that their new CEO was sitting 20 feet away, wearing rhinestone earrings and enduring well-meaning, career advice from relatives who were trying to help her find entry-level employment. Elena's family and friends filled the remaining tables, a mix of advertising industry professionals, college roommates, and extended family members who knew David primarily through Elena's glowing descriptions of her successful fiancé. They would provide an interesting neutral audience for what was about to unfold, people who had no preconceived notions about Romano family dynamics and would simply witness the evening's revelations as outside observers. The lighting in the ballroom had been adjusted for the speeches, with soft spotlights focusing attention on the head table while leaving the rest of the room in gentle, ambient lighting. The effect was intimate and elegant, creating exactly the kind of atmosphere where significant moments feel both personal and ceremonial. David stood up and straightened his bow tie, a gesture I remembered from childhood whenever he was preparing to do something important. Whether it was giving a presentation in school or asking someone to prom, David had always adjusted his tie before stepping into the spotlight. Some habits never change, even when the stakes grow larger and the audience becomes more sophisticated. The wedding coordinator handed him the microphone, and the room fell completely silent, except for the soft clink of champagne glasses being set down on tables and the gentle hum of the building's air circulation system. David took a moment to look around the room, making eye contact with different sections of guests, building the kind of connection with his audience that had served him so well in his professional life. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Elena and I are overwhelmed by the love and support that has brought all of you here tonight to celebrate with us." The warmth in his voice was genuine, and I could see guests throughout the room, leaning forward slightly, drawn in by his natural charisma and obvious happiness. This was David at his best, confident but humble, grateful but not self-deprecating, ready to share his joy without making it about his own achievements. "Before I talk about Elena and our future together," David continued, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge the people who shaped me into the man I am today." Here it comes, I thought, settling back in my chair and preparing for what would be the last few minutes of my family's blissful ignorance about the dynamics that had actually been shaping our lives for the past 7 years. David's speech was about to provide the perfect setup for Harrison's revelation, and Harrison's revelation was about to change everything my family thought they knew about success, failure, and who had actually been taking care of whom all along. The final act was about to begin. David's voice filled the ballroom as he continued his speech, building toward the moment that would change everything. "You know, success means different things to different people, and I've been fortunate to be surrounded by family members who've taught me that there's more than one path to achievement." He paused, looking directly at our parents' table where my mother was already dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, clearly moved by David's heartfelt words about family values and support. "Take my sister Isabella, for example," David said, gesturing in my direction as every head in the room turned to look at me. "She's been on her own unique journey, exploring different opportunities, figuring out what success means to her." I felt the familiar weight of public attention, but this time it carried a different energy. The guests were looking at me with the polite interest that wedding audiences give to family members being acknowledged in speeches, completely unaware that they were about to witness something unprecedented. "Isabella has always been brilliant," David continued, his tone warm, but tinged with the gentle condescension that had become so familiar over the years. "But she's also been, let's say she's been taking her time to find her place in the professional world. While some of us chose more traditional career paths, Isabella has been exploring, experimenting, trying to figure out where her talents fit best." The scattered applause that followed was polite but carried undertones of sympathy. I could see guests exchanging glances that clearly communicated their understanding that they were witnessing a brother's loving but public acknowledgement of his sister's struggles. "I admire that about her," David said, building toward what he clearly thought was an inspiring message about different definitions of success. "Not everyone has to follow the same path. Not everyone has to measure their worth by conventional standards. Sometimes the most important thing is just figuring out who you are and what you want to contribute to the world." The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it. David genuinely believed he was being supportive, honoring my journey, while simultaneously making it clear to everyone in the room that my journey had been longer and more uncertain than his own straightforward march to professional achievement. "So here's to everyone who's still writing their story," David said, raising his champagne glass. "Here's to those of us who've found our path, and here's to those who are still discovering theirs. We love you all the same." The applause that followed was warm but distinctly patronizing. I could feel the waves of sympathetic appreciation from guests who thought they were witnessing a beautiful moment of family acceptance for someone who hadn't quite figured out how to succeed in life. That's when Harrison Webb stood up. The movement was smooth and deliberate, drawing attention without seeming intrusive. Harrison had perfect timing. He waited for the applause to die down and for David to begin moving toward his next topic before rising from his seat at the Brightstone financial table. "Excuse me?" Harrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet ballroom. "I'm sorry to interrupt, David, but I think there might be some confusion here." David looked surprised, but not alarmed. Harrison was his respected boss, someone whose opinion mattered enormously to David's career prospects. If Harrison wanted to add something to the conversation, David was certainly going to listen. "Please," David said graciously, gesturing toward Harrison with the microphone still in his hand. "Harrison Webb, everyone. My boss at Brightstone Financial and one of the most respected leaders in our industry." Harrison walked toward the front of the room with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of executive leadership. Every step was measured, every movement designed to command attention without appearing dramatic. The ballroom had fallen completely silent, with guests sensing that something significant was about to happen without understanding what. "Thank you, David," Harrison said, accepting the microphone with a slight smile. "That was a beautiful speech about family and different paths to success, but I think your guests might be interested to know a little more about your sister's particular path." I felt my heart rate increase, not from nervousness, but from anticipation. 7 years of careful construction were about to be revealed in the next few sentences, and there was no going back from whatever happened next. Harrison turned to face me directly, his expression shifting from corporate politeness to genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Isabella Romano, founder and CEO of Meridian Industries." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic outside the ballroom. Windows. For several seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. David's face went through a series of expressions so rapidly that it was almost comic. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then a kind of dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. His mouth opened and closed twice without any sound coming out. "Isabella founded Meridian 7 years ago," Harrison continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, "and has built it into one of the most innovative technology companies in the world. In fact, as of 6 months ago, Meridian Industries owns Brightstone Financial." The silence shattered like glass. A wave of gasps, exclamations, and confused murmurs rippled through the ballroom as guests tried to process what they had just heard. At the Romano family tables, the reactions ranged from stunned silence to obvious disbelief. My mother's champagne glass slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor, but she didn't seem to notice. "Isabella," Harrison said, looking directly at me, "would you like to say something?" I stood up slowly, smoothing down my navy dress, and began walking toward the front of the room. Every step felt surreal, as if I was moving through a dream sequence where the normal rules of reality had been suspended. The rhinestone earrings my aunt had insisted I wear caught the light from the chandeliers, creating tiny sparkles that seemed absurdly festive given the magnitude of what was happening. When I reached the microphone, I looked out at a sea of faces, displaying every possible variation of shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. David was still standing beside me, the color completely drained from his face, looking like someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "And thank you, David, for that lovely speech about different paths to success." I paused, letting the irony of his words settle over the room like a blanket. "David's absolutely right that success means different things to different people," I continued. "For some people, success means climbing the corporate ladder, building an impressive resume, and achieving recognition within established systems. For others, success means building the ladder itself." The Brightstone financial executives were staring at me with expressions of complete bewilderment, trying to reconcile the woman they had spent the evening offering career advice to with the revelation that she was actually their ultimate boss. Meridian Industries acquired Brightstone Financial 6 months ago, I explained, as part of our expansion into regional financial services markets. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a strategic acquisition designed to enhance Brightstone's capabilities while preserving the relationships and culture that make it successful. David finally found his voice. "Isabella," he said, barely above a whisper. "Is this real?" I looked at my brother, my successful, confident, accomplished brother who had just spent 10 minutes publicly describing me as someone who was still figuring out how to contribute to the world, and felt a complex mixture of love, sadness, and vindication. "It's real, David," I said gently. "And congratulations on your promotion to Regional Director of Client Development. Harrison has your offer letter in his briefcase." The ballroom erupted into chaos as guests began talking all at once, their voices creating a cacophony of confusion, amazement, and frantic attempts to understand what they had just witnessed. Cell phones appeared as people began frantically Googling Meridian Industries and Isabella Romano, trying to verify what seemed impossible. But through all the noise and confusion, I kept my eyes on David's face, watching as my brother, the golden child, the family success story, the one who had everything figured out, struggled to comprehend that his little sister had been quietly building an empire while he was building a career. The chaos in the ballroom was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Conversations erupted at every table as guests turned to each other with expressions of disbelief, frantically trying to process what they had just heard. The carefully orchestrated elegance of the wedding reception had transformed into something resembling a corporate announcement meeting gone completely off script. At the Brightstone financial tables, executives were pulling out their phones and typing frantically, their faces shifting between confusion and excitement as Google search results confirmed what seemed impossible. Robert Chen, who had politely listened to my family's career advice an hour earlier, was staring at his phone screen with his mouth hanging open. Sarah Martinez was showing her search results to colleagues, pointing at articles about Meridian Industries' market valuation and recent acquisitions. "This can't be right," I heard someone say loudly. "She's just David's sister. She drives a Honda Civic." But the evidence was mounting with each search result. Forbes articles about mysterious tech CEOs, Businessweek profiles of companies that had revolutionized entire industries while maintaining unprecedented secrecy about their leadership. Stock market reports showing Meridian Industries' meteoric rise and strategic acquisitions that had reshaped multiple sectors. David was still, standing beside me at the microphone, but he seemed frozen in place, unable to move or speak. His wedding speech, which just minutes ago had positioned him as the successful brother graciously acknowledging his struggling sister, now hung in the air like a monument to misunderstanding. My mother had finally noticed her broken champagne glass and was staring at the shards scattered around her feet, as if they represented everything she thought she knew about her daughter. My father was leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed, probably calculating how many times he had offered me financial advice or suggested I ask David for help with my career. The Romano family tables had descended into urgent whispered conferences. I could see my Aunt Carmen gesturing wildly as she spoke to my Uncle Tony, probably recounting every conversation she'd had with me about finding real work. My cousin, Jessica, was frantically scrolling through her phone, searching for information about the woman she had spent the evening trying to network on behalf of. Elena, to her credit, was trying to maintain some semblance of composure, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes as she processed the implications of what had just happened. Her wedding reception, the event she had planned so carefully to celebrate David's success and their bright future together, had suddenly become the setting for a revelation that fundamentally changed the dynamics of her new family. Harrison. Webb had returned to his table, where the other Brightstone executives were bombarding him with questions. I could hear fragments of urgent conversations. How long has she owned the company? What does this mean for our jobs? Why didn't anyone tell us? The answers Harrison was providing in low, professional tones were creating ripples of amazement throughout the Brightstone contingent. The mysterious efficiency improvements they had noticed over the past 6 months, the enhanced technology systems, the improved benefits packages, all of it suddenly made sense in a way that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. My phone was buzzing continuously in my clutch, undoubtedly with messages from Rebecca and other Meridian executives who were monitoring news alerts and social media mentions. The story of tonight's revelation would be trending on business Twitter within hours, and by Monday morning, every major financial publication would be calling for interviews with the tech CEO who had revealed her identity at her brother's wedding. But the immediate consequences were playing out right here in this ballroom, in real time, as 150 wedding guests tried to reconcile what they had thought they knew with what they were discovering to be true. David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Isabella, I don't understand. When did this happen? How did this happen?" 7 years ago, I replied simply. "I started Meridian Industries the year after college, while you were beginning your career at Brightstone. But you live in that tiny apartment. You drive that old car. You never—" His voice trailed off as the implications continued to sink in. "I live in the penthouse of a building I own," I said gently. "I drive a car that's paid for because I prefer reliability over status, symbols. And I never told you because I wanted to build something real before anyone tried to tell me it was impossible." My Aunt Patricia had recovered enough from her shock to become indignant. She stood up from her table and marched toward the front of the room with the determination of someone who had been personally deceived. "Isabella Romano," she announced loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "Do you mean to tell me that we've been worrying about you all these years while you were secretly rich?" The bluntness of her question cut through the chaos and focused everyone's attention back on the central drama playing out between my family and me. This wasn't just about business acquisitions or corporate revelations. This was about years of family dynamics that had been built on completely false assumptions. "I was never secretly rich, Aunt Patricia," I replied, still holding the microphone. "I was building a company. The wealth came later as a result of the work." "But we offered you jobs," my cousin Mike called out from his table. "We tried to help you get interviews. Why didn't you tell us?" The hurt in his voice was real, and I understood it. From their perspective, they had spent years offering assistance to someone who not only didn't need help, but was actually in a position to help them in ways they couldn't have imagined. "Because I needed to prove to myself that I could do it," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Because the moment I told anyone what I was building, it would have stopped being my achievement and started being something that happened to me." My mother had finally stood up and was walking toward the front of the room, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't entirely read. When she reached the microphone area, she looked at me with a mixture of pride, confusion, and what might have been grief. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "we thought you needed our help. We thought you were struggling." "I know, Mom," I replied, taking her hand. "And I love you for wanting to help. But I needed to struggle. I needed to figure it out on my own, without anyone telling me what was possible or impossible." David had been silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with a question that I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Isabella, the promotion Harrison mentioned, did you have me promoted because I'm your brother?" The ballroom fell silent again as everyone waited for my answer. This was the question that would determine whether David could maintain his professional pride or whether he would have to live with the knowledge that his achievements had been influenced by nepotism. I looked at my brother, my talented, hardworking, genuinely capable brother, and gave him the truth he deserved. "David, I reviewed every employee file at Brightstone during the acquisition process. Your performance ratings, client feedback, and strategic contributions were among the highest in the company. The promotion was approved based on merit, not family relationships, In fact, if anything, I held you to a higher standard because you're my brother." The relief that washed over David's face was visible to everyone in the room. Whatever else had been revealed tonight, he could still take pride in his own accomplishments and know that his career advancement was based on his abilities rather than family connections. But the reckoning was far from over. Elena approached, the microphone with the composure of someone who had just realized that her understanding of her new family's dynamics required complete revision. "Isabella," she said carefully, "I need to ask, is there anything else we should know? Any other surprises that are going to change how we understand this family?" The question was fair, and I appreciated Elena's directness. She deserved to know what she was marrying into, especially since the Romano family dynamics had just been revealed to be far more complex than anyone had realized. I looked out at the ballroom full of wedding guests, family members, and business associates, all of them waiting to hear whether there were more revelations to come. The truth was, there were dozens of secrets that could still be revealed. Years of anonymous financial support, business relationships that connected to family members in ways they couldn't imagine, and strategic decisions that had been made, with Romano family considerations in mind, but tonight had already transformed everyone's understanding of what was possible. Anything more would risk overshadowing David and Elena's celebration entirely. "Elena," I said, taking a deep breath as I considered how much truth this evening could handle. There are always more layers to any family's story. But tonight isn't about revealing every secret or restructuring every relationship. Tonight is about celebrating you and David, and I think we've had quite enough surprises for one wedding reception. The laughter that rippled through the ballroom was tentative but genuine, a sign that people were beginning to process the shock and find their footing in this new reality. Elena smiled gratefully, clearly appreciating my decision to preserve what remained of her wedding celebration rather than turning it into a complete exposé of Romano family dynamics. "However," I continued, looking directly at my parents, "I do want to address something that's probably weighing on everyone's minds right now." I paused, choosing my words carefully. The next few sentences would determine whether this revelation brought my family closer together or created wounds that might never fully heal. For the past 3 years, various members of our family have received unexpected financial assistance, I said, watching recognition dawn on several faces throughout the Romano family tables. Anonymous scholarships, community service awards, small business grants, mortgage assistance programs, all of them came from foundations and organizations that ultimately trace back to Meridian Industries. The silence that followed was different. From the shocked silence of the earlier revelation, this was contemplative, introspective, as family members began connecting dots they hadn't realized existed. My Uncle Frank was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. "The business expansion grant that saved my plumbing company last year?" "Yes," I replied simply. My cousin Maria put her hand to her mouth. "The medical school scholarship that appeared out of nowhere when I couldn't afford my final year?" "Yes, my—" Father's voice was barely audible when he asked, "The community service award that paid off our mortgage?" "Yes, Dad." What followed was a chain reaction of realizations as family members began to understand that their struggling Isabella had actually been their anonymous benefactor for years. The daughter they had worried about, offered help to, and gently guided toward more stable career choices had actually been the one ensuring their financial stability all along. My mother was crying now, but they weren't tears of shock or confusion. They were tears of a parent who had just realized that her child had been taking care of the entire family while allowing everyone to believe she needed their care. "Isabella," my mother said through her tears, "why didn't you tell us?" It was the question I had been preparing for since the moment I started the Romano Family Foundation, but answering it in front of 150 wedding guests felt surreal. Because the moment you knew it was me helping, it would have changed the dynamic, I explained. It would have become about gratitude and obligation instead of family love. I wanted to help because I could, not because you owed me anything. David had been silent during this revelation about the family foundation, but now he stepped forward with a question that went to the heart of everything that had happened tonight. Isabella, how do you not resent us? How do you not hate us for treating you like a failure when you were actually more successful than any of us could imagine? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see that David genuinely needed to understand how I had endured years of condescension and well-meaning interference without becoming bitter or angry. Because your concern came from love, I said, looking around at my extended family. Every suggestion about finding a real job, every offer to help with my resume, every worried conversation about my future, all of it came from people who cared about me and wanted me to be happy and secure. I paused, gathering my thoughts for what I knew would be the most important part of my response. The fact that you were wrong about what I needed doesn't change the fact that you were right to care. The fact that your help wasn't necessary doesn't mean your willingness to help wasn't meaningful. My Aunt Carmen, who had spent the evening offering me career advice, was crying now too. But we must have made you feel so small, so diminished. Sometimes, I admitted honestly, but mostly you made me feel loved, and you gave me something incredibly valuable. You gave me the motivation to prove that unconventional paths could lead to extraordinary destinations. The conversation was interrupted by scattered applause that began at the Brightstone financial tables and spread throughout the ballroom. It wasn't the polite applause of wedding guests acknowledging a speech. It was the genuine appreciation of people who had just witnessed something remarkable. Harrison Webb stood up again, and the room quieted to hear what he had to say. "If I may," Harrison said, "I think this evening has demonstrated something important about leadership, success, and family dynamics that everyone here should remember." He looked around the room before continuing. Isabella Romano built one of the most successful companies in the world while maintaining such humility and grace that her own family didn't recognize her achievements. That's not just business acumen. That's character. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, and I could see that the narrative in the room had shifted. What had begun as shock at my deception had transformed into admiration for what people were beginning to understand as a remarkable demonstration of quiet leadership and family loyalty. Elena approached the microphone, and I gladly stepped aside to let her reclaim her role as the evening's hostess. "I think," Elena said with a smile that was both emotional and genuine, "that David and I couldn't have asked for a better example of what it means to build something meaningful while staying true to your values. Isabella, thank you for trusting us with your story tonight." She turned to address the entire ballroom. "And thank you all for being here to witness not just David's and my wedding, but a truly extraordinary revelation about what success can look like when it's built with purpose and humility." The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just acknowledgement of my business achievements. It was recognition of a different way of approaching success, family, and the relationship between public achievement and private character. As the applause died down and guests began returning to their tables, David approached me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't the confident smile of the successful older brother or the concerned look of someone worried about his struggling sister. It was the expression of someone who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his family had been transformed. "Isabella," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight, but for years of assumptions and condescension." "David, you don't owe me anything," I replied. "You've been a wonderful brother, even when you were wrong about my situation. But I have to ask," he continued, "what happens now? How do we go forward from here?" It was a question that would affect not just our sibling relationship, but the entire family dynamic that had been built on assumptions that no longer existed. "We go forward the same way we always have," I said simply. "As family. The only difference is that now you know the truth about what I've been building all these years." I looked around the ballroom, where wedding guests were still processing what they had witnessed, where Brightstone financial executives were still trying to understand their new corporate reality, and where my family was still coming to terms with years of misunderstood dynamics. The truth is, I continued, success isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about building something meaningful and using whatever platform you create to take care of the people who matter to you. I picked up my evening clutch and prepared to return to my table, but I turned back to David one more time. Congratulations on your wedding, your promotion, and your future with Elena. You've built something beautiful together, and that's the kind of success that actually matters. As I walked back through the ballroom, past tables of guests who were now looking at me with newfound respect and understanding, I reflected on the evening's events. 7 years of careful construction had been revealed in a single moment, transforming not just how my family saw me, but how I saw myself. The best part wasn't the vindication or the recognition. The best part was that I could finally stop being invisible and start being myself. Someone who had built an empire not to prove a point, but to create possibilities for everyone I cared about. And as the evening continued around me, with David and Elena cutting their wedding cake and guests returning to the celebration, I realized that the most successful thing I had ever built wasn't a company at all. It was a family that loved each other enough to grow, change, and embrace new truths, even when those truths challenged everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and what it means to take care of each other. The story I had been telling myself for 7 years, that I was building something in secret, had been transformed into a new story. That I had been building something to share, and tonight was finally the moment when the sharing could begin. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.